In the 112th Rifle Division, clinging to a precarious sector of the front northwest of Moscow, the most important man was not the divisional commander, nor the political commissar. It was Senior Sergeant Mikhail Ilyich Krikalev, a remontnik, a repair mechanic. He was a block of a man, with hands like bundles of welding cable, and a face perpetually smudged with grease and soot, etched with lines of squinting into engine blocks and blizzards. He had no formal education past a village technical school. He carried no blueprints, only a deep, tactile understanding of metal, stress, and failure. His kingdom was a so-called workshop, a roofless barn on the outskirts of a shattered hamlet, open to the sky and the snow. Here, the wounded machinery of the division came to die, or to be resurrected. Crippled T-34s with track links snapped like pretzels, gauze trucks with engines seized solid from cold, Maxim machine guns with water jackets frozen and cracked. Krikalev moved among them like a field surgeon in a hemorrhaging ward. His tools a mix of the official, wrenches, hammers, a portable forge, and the scavenged, a bent tractor axle used as a pry bar, a mess tin for melting snow to cool a heated bearing, a length of telegraph wire for makeshift stitching. The officers saw a competent sergeant, a workhorse. The soldiers saw a magician who could sometimes coax one more mile, one more burst from a dying machine. But to the vast, impersonal bureaucracy of the Red Army, to the design bureaus in Gorky, the artillery factories in the Urals, the generals in Moscow planning grand offensives, Mikhail Krikalev did not exist. He was a statistical unit of labor, a pair of hands to execute repairs according to Manual TM 34-76. And that was his great advantage. While scientists in sealed labs theorized about superior alloys, and engineers drafted perfect schematics for weapons that would roll off pristine assembly lines, Krikalev lived in the brutal reality where those perfect weapons came to die. He saw not the ideal, but the inevitable failure, and he was unwatched, unbothered, free to think in the silence between the hammer blows. The problem was as fundamental as the cold. Soviet industry, heroic and desperate, was pumping out weapons at a staggering rate, but the journey from the factory floor to the frontline soldier was a gauntlet of railroads under Luftwaffe bombardment, of horse-drawn carts slogging through apocalyptic mud, of hasty distribution under fire. A weapon arrived not in a cosmoline-soaked crate, but in the hands of a freezing, exhausted quartermaster. It was then thrust into conditions its designers in distant, heated offices could scarcely imagine. The PPSH-41 submachine gun, the iconic burp gun, was a masterpiece of mass production, simple, rugged, and devastating in volume of fire. But in the hands of the 112th Division, it revealed its flaws. Its drum magazine was a marvel of engineering that also jammed when dirt crusted its intricate spring. Its wooden stock, soaked and frozen, could warp and misalign the receiver. The gun loved to fire, but it hated to live in the reality of a Russian winter trench. The same was true for the Mosin-Langen rifle, the Degtyaryov machine gun, the SVT-40. They were not bad weapons. They were simply human creations asked to endure inhuman conditions. A rifle bolt would freeze shut with condensation. A machine gun's recoil spring would lose tension in the cold, causing a misfeed. Grit would infiltrate tolerances measured in thousandths of an inch, grinding action to a halt. The official solution was more maintenance, more cleaning, more precious supplies of lubricant that froze anyway. The unofficial solution, accepted with a grim shrug by command, was attrition. Weapons failed, men died, and replacements trudged forward from the endless reservoir of manpower. Losses from equipment failure were simply folded into the catastrophic casualty reports, a hidden tax paid in blood and frustration. It was the cost of doing business in total war. Krikalev did not accept the tax. Every piece of machinery dragged into his barn was a testament to this failure. He didn't see a broken gun, he saw a story. The cracked stock of a Mosin told of a soldier using it as a club in close quarters. The seized bolt of a PPSH spoke of a man too exhausted to clean it after a day spent crawling through muck. The sheared firing pin of a Nagant revolver whispered of a desperation that made men fire until metal failed. Command saw statistics. Krikalev saw the ghost of the user and the intimate, fatal dialogue between man, machine, and mud. His project began not with a design, but with an accumulation of rage. It started one February night, after hours spent trying to resurrect a PPSH that had swallowed so much mud it was more a club than a firearm. As he dismantled it, his hands moved automatically, while his mind churned. The problem wasn't complexity, it was unnecessary complexity. Every moving part, every tight tolerance, every spring and latch was an invitation for the front to invade the mechanism. He began with the core of a PPSH, its robust, open-bolt, blowback operating system. This was good. It was simple. But he stripped away everything else. The intricate drum magazine was the first to go. In its place, he scavenged the straight 35-round box magazine from a destroyed German MP40 he'd found in no man's land. It was simpler, less prone to jamming, and crucially, it could be loaded with individual rounds if the spring gave out. He welded crude protective lips around its feed port from the steel of a shattered canteen. He attacked the receiver next. The original sheet metal construction was strong, but could warp. He found a section of seamless steel tubing, likely from a captured German mortar carriage, and with agony and fire, he persuaded it to become the new receiver housing. It was heavier, but it was monolithic, resistant to bending. He filed the firing mechanism down to its brutal essentials, widening tolerances not with precision tools, but with a grinding stone, creating clearances that would allow grit to pass through rather than lodge. He replaced delicate coil springs with heavier, cruder springs from truck valve assemblies, their tension overwhelming where finesse was required.
The stock was not wood, which swelled and split. He took the tubular steel leg from a broken Degtyaryov mount and bent it, with immense effort over his forge, into a crude but solid wire-frame stock, padded with wrapped strips of a rubber gas mask hose. He had no lathe, no milling machine. His tools were the forge, a heavy vise, a hacksaw, files, and a welder powered by a jury-rigged generator that coughed and sputtered. The thing that took shape on his workbench over 3 weeks of stolen moments looked monstrous. It was a patchwork of different metals, weld beads like scars, a grotesque hybrid of Soviet and German DNA. It was ugly, unbalanced, and heavy, nearly 2 pounds heavier than a standard PPSH. His fellow mechanics, when they saw it, chuckled. They called it Krikalev's pipe, or the Iron Pig. But Krikalev didn't care about looks. He had one criterion: indestructibility. He took it out behind the barn, into a frozen ditch. He loaded it with a mix of new and corroded cartridges. He buried it in snow, dug it out dripping, and fired. He dumped mud into the action, shook it roughly, and fired. He fired until the barrel was hot enough to sizzle snow, then let it freeze and fired again. Each time, the heavy bolt slammed home with a sound like a railroad coupling. It cycled, it fed, it fired. It was not a precision instrument. It was a mechanical sledgehammer that happened to fire bullets. The test came not from command, but from desperation. A small reconnaissance patrol from the division's scout platoon was slated to go out into a blizzard to probe a German outpost. Their lieutenant, a pragmatic man named Vasily, who had traded cigarettes for Krikalev's repairs on his own pistol, heard the rumors of the mechanic's Fools project. As the patrol prepared, their weapons already frosting over, Vasily sought out Krikalev. "Sergeant, that thing of yours, will it fire?" Krikalev, without a word, took the weapon from where it leaned against the barn wall. He plunged it into a nearby barrel of slushy water, pulled it out dripping, and emptied the magazine into a stacked wall of frozen firewood. The sound was a deep, throaty brap, slower than the PPSH's frantic snarl, but utterly deliberate. He handed it, still dripping, to the lieutenant. Vasily took it, hefted its unfamiliar weight. "It's a pig that won't stop eating," Krikalev replied. That night, the patrol slipped into the swirling white. The skirmish was a brief, confused affair in near zero visibility, flashes of muzzle light in the snow, guttural shouts in 2 languages. The patrol returned, 1 man wounded, claiming 2 enemy casualties. No official report was filed. It was too minor. But in the dugout afterward, as the men cleaned their weapons, the story began to circulate. Private Leonid, the scout who had carried Krikolev's weapon, spoke in a low, awed voice. His PPSH had jammed halfway across no man's land, a round frozen in the chamber. In a panic, he'd dropped it and taken the iron pig from where it was slung on his back. He'd tripped and fallen face first into a snowdrift, the weapon submerged. He'd risen, ice clogging the barrel, and returned fire. It worked. Later, crawling through a shell crater full of freezing mud, the action had been packed solid. He smacked the charging handle with the heel of his frozen hand, and it had cycled, ejecting a slug of frozen mud. He fired the rest of the magazine without a hitch. "It's not a gun," Leonid said, staring at the crude, mud-caked object. "It's a thing that shoots. It doesn't care." The news did not travel up the chain of command. Officers had no interest in a sergeant's bizarre non-regulation hobby. Instead, it traveled horizontally, through the lifeblood of the army, the network of soldiers, and, most importantly, the fraternity of mechanics. Other Remontikny from nearby regiments, hearing the tale, visited Krikolev's barn. They examined the weapon with professional curiosity, noting the widened tolerances, the brutal simplicity, the scavenged parts. They asked questions not about theory, but about practice. What kind of spring? How did you shape the tube? Where did you find the steel? Krikalev shared everything. He had no patents, no pride of ownership. He had a solution. In other broken barns and frozen dugouts, other pairs of grease-blackened hands began to move. They looked at the piles of wreckage around them not as scrap, but as a pharmacy of parts. The concept, not the specific design, began to replicate. It was the birth of a virus of practicality, of frontline ingenuity, born in the mud and spreading from mechanic to mechanic, a silent grassroots revolution against the tyranny of failure. The weapon that would change the front wasn't being shipped from a factory, it was being grown, organically and quietly, in the frozen soil of the front itself. The winter thaw of 1943 did not bring relief, it brought the Rasputitsa, the season of mud, a time when the earth itself became the enemy. Roads dissolved into bottomless sucking bogs. Men and machines vanished into chocolate-colored sludge. In this world, where a rifle could become a useless, mud-caked club in minutes, the story of Krikolev's iron pig ceased to be a curious anecdote and became a blueprint for survival. The replication was not industrial, it was viral, organic, born of necessity, and shared through the grimy word-of-mouth network of the front. A mechanic from the 112th would be sent to a neighboring regiment to help repair an artillery tractor. In a quiet moment, over a shared tin of weak tea and coarse tobacco, he would mention, "We've got a sergeant back in the 112th, Krikolev, madman, built a submachine gun out of a pipe and truck springs. The thing fires underwater." He'd sketch the basic principle in the dirt with a stick, the heavy bolt, the widened receiver, the simple box magazine. That was all it took. In a workshop near Veliki Luki, a mechanic named Anatoly used the barrel shroud from a shattered DP-27 light machine gun as his receiver tube. Near Kharkov, a woman named Zoya, a former factory lathe operator turned armor mechanic, precision bored a receiver from a solid billet of steel salvaged from a German half-track, creating a version more refined but just as brutal. In the forests of the Leningrad front, partisans built them in hidden forges, their versions even cruder, using springs from furniture and barrels machined from tractor axles.
No two were identical. Some had pistol grips carved from birch. Others retained a skeletal wire stock, while some forewent a stock entirely. They were chambered for whatever was plentiful, 7.62 by 25 mm Tokarev, 9 by 19 mm Parabellum from captured stock, even the odd batch of 45 ACP from Lend-Lease supplies scavenged from a downed American plane. They were united not by a spec sheet, but by a philosophy, overbuilt, oversprung, with tolerances you could measure with your fingernail. They were never issued. They appeared in units like spontaneous generation. A squad would return from a brutal, muddy patrol, and there, leaning against a dugout wall, would be one of these ugly, brutal things, with a note, "For the scouts, don't clean it, just shoot it." They had no official designation. Soldiers called them prochniaks, the durable ones, Kuryazoviki, mutters, or simply Nash, ours. The effect on local tactics was immediate and profound. Assault squads, who traditionally had to time their attacks for firm ground or clear weather, found they could now push through the very conditions the enemy thought impassable. A German company commander near Orel filed a baffled report after a Soviet night attack in a driving sleet storm. The enemy advanced through knee-deep mire, expected their automatic weapons to be non-functional. Instead, they laid down a sustained volume of fire from what sounded like heavy-caliber weapons, though the rate of fire was slower than the typical PPSH. Our MG-34 positions, hampered by the wet, were overwhelmed. Small pockets of resistance, cut off and assumed neutralized when their weapons froze or fouled, were found to be stubbornly alive days later, still putting out fire. German intelligence began noticing a discrepancy. Soviet small arms fire, in certain sectors, did not diminish in poor conditions as expected. It was a subtle shift, a grinding down at the edges, 1,000 tiny actions where the Red Army soldier, armed with a weapon that refused to quit, gained a fractional psychological edge. The front, silently, was adopting a new standard of reliability, forged not in a ministry office, but in the frozen mud. The system, as all vast systems do, eventually noticed the anomaly. In the spring of 1943, a colonel of the NKVD's Special Department, tasked with counterintelligence and political reliability on the front, was reviewing reports of unauthorized equipment modifications. It was a standard concern. Soldiers tampering with weapons could lead to accidents, or worse, sabotage. One report from a political officer in the 112th Rifle Division mentioned a Sergeant Krikalev hoarding parts and constructing non-regulation firearms, potentially for partisan or subversive use. The colonel, a suspicious man by profession, arrived at Krikalev's barn workshop expecting to find a nest of treachery. What he found instead was a scene of industrious chaos and a demonstration that shattered his understanding of warfare. Krikalev, summoned from beneath a truck, stood silently as the colonel, flanked by two stone-faced junior officers, surveyed the scene. On a rough bench lay not one, but several of the hybrid weapons, each a unique monstrosity of welding and grit. Scattered around were the corpses of standard-issue weapons, PPSHs with cracked receivers, Moissons with rusted bolts, a Degtyaryov with a bent operating rod. "Explain this, Sergeant," the colonel demanded, pointing at the bench of mutants. Krikalev, his face unreadable, simply picked up the original iron pig. Without a word, he walked to a water barrel, submerged the weapon dripping, and fired a burst into a stacked earth berm. The heavy thump-thump-thump was unmistakable. Then he took a handful of fine, abrasive sand from a bucket used for cleaning and poured it directly into the open ejection port. He worked the bolt back and forth, the gritty sound audible, then fired another burst. It cycled perfectly. Then he handed the colonel a standard PPSH from the scrap pile. "Try it, Comrade Colonel." The colonel, a staff officer whose weapon was largely ceremonial, awkwardly mimicked the actions. He dipped the PPSH's muzzle in the water. He poured a smaller amount of sand into its mechanism. When he pulled the trigger, the result was a sickening click, followed by a jammed bolt that refused to move. The demonstration was repeated with ice, with thick mud. The result was always the same. The regulation weapon failed. Krikalev's creation, ugly and inelegant, simply worked. The colonel's initial anger at the breach of regulations curdled into a deeper, more unsettling emotion: fear. It was not fear of sabotage, but fear of the implication. Here was a lowly sergeant with no authority, no resources, and no permission, who had solved a critical frontline problem that had eluded the entire military-industrial bureaucracy. He had not just modified a weapon, he had implicitly critiqued the entire system of design, supply, and command. If one man in a frozen barn could do this, what other solutions, what other parallel systems were being built outside the official channels? What did it say about the rigidity of the Red Army itself? The power structure relied on control, on everything flowing from the top down. Krikalev represented the terrifying opposite, innovation bubbling up from the bottom, from the mud itself. The colonel did not praise Krikalev. He did not condemn him. He confiscated 3 of the weapons and all Krikalev's notes, rough sketches on the backs of ration packets and artillery shell casing labels. He filed a report that was a masterpiece of bureaucratic ambivalence, acknowledging the interesting robustness of the design, while sternly noting the unacceptable breach of procurement and modification protocols. The report and the weapons made their way up the chain, not to a tribunal, but to the Technical Evaluation Department of the main Artillery Directorate.
The captured Prochniaks landed on the desk of engineers who were not NKVD ideologues, but practical men drowning in field reports of weapon failures. They tested them. They subjected them to mud baths, freezing chambers, sandstorms, and drop tests that would have turned a standard weapon into a pretzel. The results were undeniable. The weapons were horribly inaccurate beyond 50 meters, their crude sights and heavy triggers making precision fire a joke. They were heavy, taxing for a soldier to carry on long marches, but they were, for their intended purpose of close-quarter, extreme-condition combat, unbreakable. The system, faced with an unsanctioned but undeniable success, did what large systems sometimes do. It co-opted it. There was no time for a full redesign, no capacity for a new production line. Instead, in late 1943, an urgent technical bulletin was circulated to state arms factories, particularly those producing the PPSH-41. It contained interim reliability modifications to be implemented immediately. The changes were pure Krikalev, sanitized of his name and origin. Widen critical tolerances in the bolt and receiver channel. Replace the 71-round drum magazine with a more reliable 35-round box magazine as standard. Harden the recoil spring. Simplify the firing pin mechanism. The result was not a new weapon, but a hardened variant of the old one. It began rolling off the lines and onto the trains heading east. It was not called Krikalev's Prochniak. Officially, it was just the PPSH-41, late 1943 production, but its impact on the battlefield was profound and tactical. The shift was not in grand strategy, but in the brutal arithmetic of platoon and company-level combat. Infantry units advanced in conditions once considered impossible. The great Soviet offensives of 1944, Operation Bagration, the Vistula-Oder offensive, were still exercises in massive artillery preparation and armored spearheads, but the infantry that followed those spearheads, that had to clear the forests, the marshes, and the shattered urban landscapes, now did so with a new confidence. An autumn rain that turned fields to soup was no longer a showstopper. A winter blizzard was an opportunity, not a calamity. The common soldier, armed with a weapon he trusted to fire when wet, cold, or dirty, was a bolder soldier. Defensive lines held longer. A machine gun nest or a squad in a hedgerow, armed with these durable weapons, could sustain its firepower through artillery barrages that churned the earth around them into muck. They could fight effectively even when supply lines were cut and cleaning kits were non-existent. This granted precious extra hours for reserves to mobilize, for flanks to be shored up. Supply failures mattered less. The weapon's ability to digest a variety of ammunition and to function with minimal maintenance reduced the crippling logistical burden on the advancing Red Army. A division could maintain its combat effectiveness further from its supply dumps for longer periods than its German counterpart. It didn't win the war alone. No infantry weapon could claim that. Tanks, artillery, air power, and the sheer grinding weight of Soviet manpower were the decisive factors. But Krikalev's Prochniak, or rather the philosophy it embodied, shifted momentum where it mattered most, in the close-up, personal, terrifying world of the infantryman. It gave the Soviet soldier one less thing to worry about in a world designed to kill him. It guaranteed that when he pulled the trigger, the weapon would answer. In a war of industrial attrition and human suffering, that reliability was a form of mercy and a powerful, silent form of revolution. The mechanic in the frozen barn had not just built a better weapon,
He had, in his own stubborn, practical way, given the common soldier a fragment of control in a chaos that sought to strip it all away. The front changed because for the first time, the tool in the soldier's hands was as enduring as his will to survive.